Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Cuartero Central School 2021 Search for Best at-Home Learning Space on the implementation of DepEd's distance learning delivery modalities under the new education landscape.
The pandemic has changed the dynamics of teaching-learning process. Education has to change, adapt, and create new programs to ensure that the learners still receive the best and quality education. With this, At-Home Learning Spaces program on distance learning delivery modalities under the new education landscape of school year 2020-2021 is born. Having this said, I would like to welcome everyone watching at the safety of their homes to the 2021 Cuartero Central School Search for Best at-Home Learning Space. To begin the program, let us have the singing of the national anthem by Ma'am Monina B. Bermejo, to be followed by the prayer by the Cuartero Central School Choir, as well as the singing of the regional, Capiz, and Cuartero hymn on screen.
Sa simoy at sa langit ng baga, may nilatang tula at awit sa paglalang ang kislap ng matawat mo'y tagumpay na nakagana. Ang bituin ng araw niya kailan pa may pagtitin lupa ng
Under the western Visayan blue skies, the cradle of hope for the young ones lies. Sows the seed of love and zest for life, weaves real vision of beacon light. Keep the song alive in our hearts, song of the great western Visayas, echoing the love and pride of years gone by. The region's banner proudly and wisdom, treasure trove of knowledge and devotion to greatness beyond our games before. Onward we march to the region's glory, working towards excellence and quality, never to quit, never to falter. Hand in hand we strive together. Western Visayas, home of champions, seat of lofty dreams and wisdom, treasure trove of knowledge and devotion to greatness beyond our games before, to greatness beyond our games before.
Atong tulokon na malayo lakon banwa pangitaon, dalang buhanon sa dugay nga handom ang banwa maangkon. Cuartero, cuartero, dugay sang langit nga naagom. Cuartero, cuartero, ikaw paglaom kag inspirasyon. Yari bato na ang himpit nga gugma sa tagsa-tagsa, maghiliw sa pagtinad ang dala sa singhi nga banwa. Cuartero, cuartero, bugay sang langit nga naagom. Cuartero, cuartero, inspirasyon. Maghinang panay kag magbinuligay, malain isikway. Maghinirupay kag magkinalipay, sa banwa nga tunay. Cuartero, Cuartero, bugay sang langit nga naagum. Cuartero, Cuartero, ikaw paglaom kag inspirasyon. Ikaw paglaom kag inspirasyon. Ikaw paglaom kag inspirasyon.
To formally welcome us all to this program, let us hear a message from our hardworking and beautiful leader, Dr. Luz Armayo, Principal 3.
For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plan to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Jeremiah 29 verse 11. Toward their parents and guardians, it is all your desire that your children will enjoy their childhood and to be successful in the future. Perhaps we are sad because our children nowadays have not enjoyed their childhood due to COVID-19 pandemic. They couldn't play games, run on the playground, go to school, and do other things they like. Remember, things are not always sunny and perfect in man's life. There are times when challenging events happen in our lives, as what we are now experiencing for almost 2 years. The COVID-19 had brought a great disaster since there were millions of people are dying at any age. The schooling of children was not the same as before. No more face-to-face of classes. It's because each one is afraid to be affected by an enemy that cannot be seen, and that is COVID virus. As parents, we want to protect our children from harm. That's why we don't send them to school. For this reason, our Department of Education looked for a remedy to continue education in the Philippines through modular teaching in order that our children learn to navigate through these tough times in their lives. Division of Copies created a program ASLP at Home Learning Space, a small space or corner, a home, converted into a classroom, that every time children would like to study or answer their modules and assignments, the space created will be their study area, an area that is comfortable, quiet, and a peaceful space. To all parents who have joined on this 2021 search for Best Learning Space, we are happy indeed that on this year, hundreds of our beloved parents participated. Our target for this year that all pupils must have a learning space. Our search will not end today. So, whoever will win this search will serve as an entry for the district level. For the non-winning, we have still a chance because we will do the search quarterly all throughout the year. And consider yourself as a winner too because you have started planting a good seed to your children. To all who acted as facilitators of learning, I know the difficulty you were experiencing. Remember, our God is sufficient enough to give us strength and knowledge. If we will ask Him, He will not forsake us or leave us on these difficult times. Aristotle said, "The roots of education are bitter, but the fruits are sweet." To everyone, congratulations and God bless us all.
This past few months, learners, parents, and stakeholders are hard at work to bring their at-home learning spaces to fruition. With this, let us delight ourselves by watching a slideshow of various at-home learning spaces by the Cuartero Central School learners and stakeholders. These at-home learning spaces we have seen so far are not only practical, but beautiful as well. To reward the efforts and resources put in the creation of these at-home learning spaces, we will now proceed with the awarding of Certificate of Participation for grades 1 to 3.
2021 Best at Home Learning Space Grade 1 Participants. Mr. and Mrs. Che Carillo, Mr. and Mrs. Romulo Duran, Mr. and Mrs. Dennis Gregorio, Mrs. Kame Precchio, Mr. and Mrs. Fidel Prado, Mr. and Mrs. Arnel Selvino, Mrs. Jovi Andrada, Mr. and Mrs. Chobert Bautista, Miss Charlene Padasa, Mrs. Kenny Sidulio, Mr. and Mrs. Ron Ayan Pagayon, Mr. and Mrs. Arnel Opeñano, Mr. and Mrs. Renante Brotamante, Mrs. Chesa Mayo, Mrs. Evelyn Dikenya, Mr. and Mrs. Jolly Sarmoy, Mr. and Mrs. Mark Ruel Misquijo, Mrs. Alni Guevara, Mr. and Mrs. Genesis Almanzor, Mr. and Mrs. Lionel Reyes, Mr. and Mrs. Francisco Alihaga Jr., Mr. and Mrs. Wilberto Factor, Mr. and Mrs. Magdaleno Pedralba, Mr. and Mrs. Leo Laboro, and Mrs. Mildred Balsena. Advisors: Mrs. Rela Lisa Raquel, Mrs. Maria Andrea Dapoya, and Mrs. Rhoda Della. Congratulations! Grade 2 participants: Mr. and Mrs. Vicente Capuyan, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Joseph Bumiran, Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Misidio, and Mrs. Joanne Evacuado. Advisors: Mrs. Merly Himan, Mrs. Mimi Guillermo, and Mrs. Erna Onyas. Congratulations! Grade 3 participants: Mrs. Daina Dalisa, Mr. and Mrs. Ramos Sosada, Mr. and Mrs. Nover Pacto, Mr. and Mrs. Herbert Garcia, Mr. and Mrs. Arnel Garciliano, Mrs. Maricel Salomeo, Mrs. Jel Candido, Mr. and Mrs. Rodrigo Halang, Mrs. Margareta Pimentel, Mrs. Ana Joy Hicado, Miss Beza Alwan, Mrs. Rogelyn Capundan, Mr. and Mrs. Ryan Panes, Mrs. Angeli Ebeler, Mrs. Mylene Reyes, Mrs. Genevieve Venosa, and Mr. Rogelio Magbanwa. Advisors: Mrs. Flony Grace Balasa, Mrs. Maricris Peral, and Mrs. Jorilyn Selva. Congratulations!
To break the monotony of this program, let us be entertained by an intermission number by Janine Sidulio, a grade 5 learner.
I will always remember the day you kissed my lips, light as a feather. And you weren't just like this, let's never better than the summer of 2002. We were only 11, but acting like grown-ups, like we're all in a prison. Drinking from plastic cups, and your love is forever and never. Well, I guess that was true. Dancing on a hood in the middle of the woods at an old Mustang, where we sing songs with all our childhood friends. And it went like this: oops, I got letting out, Papa singing bye bye bye. Hold up, you wanna go and take a ride with me, but ain't me, baby, one more time. Paint a picture for you and me on the days when we were young, singing at the top of both our lungs. Now we're under the covers. Fast forward to 18, we are more than lovers. Yeah, we were holding it, we were holding each other. I'm taken back to 2002. Dancing on a hood in the middle of the woods in an old Mustang, where we sang songs with all our childhood friends. And it went like this: oops, I got letting out, Papa singing bye bye bye. Hold up, you wanna go and take a ride with me, but ain't me, baby, one more time. Paint a picture for you and me on the days when we were young, singing at the top of both our lungs on the day we fell in love. On the day we fell in love. Dancing in the hood in the middle of the woods in an old Mustang, where we sang songs with all our childhood friends. And it went like this: oops, I got letting out, Papa singing bye bye bye. Hold up, if you wanna go and take a ride with me, but ain't me, baby, one more time. Paint a picture for you and me on the days when we were young, singing at the top of both our lungs on the day we fell in love. On the day we fell in love. On the day we fell in love. On the day we fell in love.
We will now continue with the awarding of Certificate of Participation for grades 4 to 6.
2021 Best at Home Learning Space Grade 4 participants. Mr. and Mrs. Ken Arsena, Mr. and Mrs. Vicente Capuya, Mr. and Mrs. Niel Lenciano, Mr. and Mrs. James Adjong, Mr. and Mrs. Donald Almanzor, Mr. and Mrs. Joby Dordas, Mr. and Mrs. Joshua Henderen, Mrs. Arian May Iman, Mr. and Mrs. Jennifer Padasat, Mr. and Mrs. Joel Panes, Miss Eileen Baltazar, Mrs. Dailin Binluan, Mrs. Lizelle Arancilio, Mrs. Amabel Halwan, Mrs. Annalyn Orsowa, Mrs. Leia Peral, Mrs. Ronalyn Peral, Mrs. Wendy Dichosa Arlante, Mrs. Mericor Lojero, Mrs. Jessa Bautista, and Mrs. Melly Bagayon. Advisors: Mrs. Marjorie Basamon, Mrs. Maria Judy Bindoy, and Mrs. Joelyn Esmael. Congratulations! Grade 5 participants: Mr. and Mrs. Francisco Chusana, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Tebes, Mr. and Mrs. Josefino Garganchel, Miss Feli Park, Mr. and Mrs. Demi Nardo, Miss Shane Sidulio, Mr. and Mrs. Anthony Magbanwa, and Miss Mary Antoinette Tibor. Advisor: Mrs. Florlyn Batacandolo. Congratulations! Grade 6 participants: Mr. and Mrs. Geoffrey Berbano, Mr. and Mrs. Chester Mistidio, Mr. and Mrs. Geoffrey Francisco, Miss Christine Arancilio, Mr. and Mrs. Jose Esada, Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Mistidio Jr., Mr. and Mrs. Geoffrey Fincale, Miss Marites Apolinario, Mr. and Mrs. Ryan Magtano, Mr. and Mrs. Ronelo Di Juan, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Doctolero, Mr. and Mrs. Agustin Iman, Mr. and Mrs. Rodrigo de la Cruz, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Capundan, Mr. and Mrs. Alejandro Butchao, Mr. and Mrs. Rico Humballas, Mrs. Mibelia Delpin, Mr. and Mrs. Rexelio Piatra Jr., Mr. and Mrs. Ruel Delpin, and Mr. and Mrs. Javen Cordova. Advisors: Mrs. Yolanda Mayo and Mrs. Arlen Dinosta. Congratulations!
Let us welcome Sulpicio Sedulio, a grade 5 parent, for another intermission number.
Naririnig ako bagong mawitin, bagong mawitin. At ay, naririnig ako bagong sigaw, ay ikaw. Hindi mo ba namamalaya? Wala ka bang nararamdaman? Iga ng hangin na humahalik sa akin. Panahon na naman ng pag-ibig, panahon na naman, oh, panahon na naman ng pag-ibig. Gumising ka, tara na. Masdang nahihiyang mga mata ng bawat tao, nakasilip sa isang bagong saya. Pag-ibig na dakila, kay tagal nang nawala. Kumusta na? Nariyan ka lang pala. Hindi mo ba naman Panahon na naman ng pag-ibig. Panahon na naman, oh, panahon na naman ng pag-ibig. Gumising ka, tara na, Thank you.
At this juncture, we will now have the awarding of minor awards.
2021 Best at Home Learning Space Minor Awards for Grade 1. Mr. and Mrs. Gerald Ujaman, most economical and most organized. Mr. and Mrs. Ariel Bendoy, most organized, most conducive, and best in family support. Mr. Jeffrey Sangkap, most organized, most conducive, and best in family support. Mr. and Mrs. Hansel Paul Oliveira, most conducive. Mr. and Mrs. Ruben Campanel, most conducive and most organized. Mr. and Mrs. Elmer Huertas, most conducive and most organized. Mr. and Mrs. Chester Mysterio, most conducive and most organized. Mrs. Maylene Evacuado, most economical. Mr. and Mrs. Chelord Kundan, most conducive. Mr. and Mrs. Abel Bernal, most organized, most conducive, and best in family support. Mr. and Mrs. Alejo Arancilio, best in family support. Mr. and Mrs. Gabriel Lombre, best in family support. Mr. and Mrs. Danilo Mosada, most conducive. Mr. and Mrs. Niel Danila, most conducive and best in family support. Minor awards for grade 2. Mr. and Mrs. Chan Michael Miguel, most organized, most creative, most conducive, and best in family support. Minor awards for grade 3. Mr. and Mrs. Jennifer Javier, most organized, most creative, most economical, most conducive, and Best in Family Support. Mr. and Mrs. Elmer Tuguto Sr., most organized, most creative, most conducive, and best in family support. Mr. and Mrs. Eddie Villasis Jr., most organized. Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence Gargoles, most conducive. Mr. and Mrs. Darwin Silis Sr., most conducive. Mr. and Mrs. Felix Bello, most organized. Mr. and Mrs. Dennis Camingaw, most organized and most conducive. Mr. and Mrs. Jomar Almanzor, most conducive. Mr. and Mrs. Michael Luis Contreras, most conducive. Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Tingson, most organized. Miss Precious Hamasa, most economical. Minor awards for grade 4. Mr. and Mrs. Raydan Banga, most conducive and best in family support. Mr. and Mrs. Rinaldo Bundad, most organized, most conducive and best in family support. Mr. and Mrs. Darwin Celis, most conducive. Mr. and Mrs. Celito Columna, most organized, most conducive, and best in family support. Mr. and Mrs. Rodney Haligado, most conducive. Mr. and Mrs. Jovi Rino, most conducive, most organized, and best in family support. Mr. and Mrs. Andro Lare Robles, most conducive. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Camarines, most conducive. Mr. and Mrs. Rufino de los Reyes, most conducive. Mr. Lloyd Adam Ismael, most conducive. Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Mayo, most conducive and most creative. Mrs. Gian Alho, most economical. Mr. and Mrs. Abel Bernal, most economical and most creative. Minor award for grade 5. Miss Julian Pangko, most creative, most organized, and most conducive. Mr. and Mrs. Anel Pajarillo, most conducive, most organized, and best in family support. Mr. and Mrs. Georgie Villaeva, most conducive and most organized. Minor Awards for Grade 6. Miss Yvonne Molgada, most conducive and most organized. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Camarines, most conducive. Mr. and Mrs. Ruben Campaniel, most conducive and most organized. Miss Cory Christine Martinez, most conducive, most organized, and best in family support. Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Camacho, most organized and most creative. And Mr. and Mrs. Ronelo Opiniano, most organized and most conducive. Congratulations!
Let us welcome once again Janine Sidulio for another intermission number.
Sa isang araw, puso'y napasigaw, nahulog sa'yo, di ko na matanaw pangangatwiran ko'y di na mapagkatiwalaan. Umasa sa'yo, di na mabibitawan, na baka sakali lang di na masasaktan, ngunit pangangatwiran mo di mapagkatiwalaan. Kaya pipikit na lang, tago-taguan, maliwanag ang buwan, masarap magmahal pag hindi iniwan. Pagbilang mong tatlo, nakatago na ako, ibalik ako sa nakaraan. Langit ang natanaw, pangarap ka ikaw, lupa ang nagbigay, di na kapaghintay, sana nagpatintero at naiwasan ang impyerno. Kaya ibigit na lang at pagkasakali lang, tago-taguan, maliwanag ang buwan, masarap magmahal pag hindi iniwan. Pagbilang mong tatlo, nakatago na ako, ibalik ako sa nakaraan. Pagdating sa dulo, ako'y nasaktan mo, sinubukan paglaban, sigaw ng puso ko, ngunit papipilitin ang di naman para sa akin. Tagu-taguan, maliwanag ang buwan, masarap magmahal pag hindi iniwan. Pagbilang mong tatlo, nakatago na ako, ibalik ako sa nakaraan. Tagu-taguan, maliwanag ang buwan, masarap magmahal pag hindi iniwan. Pagbilang mong tatlo, nakatago na ako, ibalik ako sa nakaraan. Di pa naiwan, nung di pa naiwan, nung di mo iniwan. Thank you.
We have arrived at the highlights of today's program, the awarding of major awards for the Best at Home Learning Space of Cuartero Central School 2021.
Ladies and gentlemen, 2021 Best at Home Learning Space Major Award. Fifth place goes to Mr. and Mrs. Rinaldo Bundad, pupil Sean Michael Bundad, Grade 4 Special Science Class. Advisor, Mrs. Marjorie H. Basamo. Fourth place goes to Miss Julianne Fanco, pupil Jules Ayan Guray, Grade 5 Special Science Class. Advisor, Mrs. Florlyn D. Batacandulo. Third place goes to Mr. and Mrs. Chan Michael Miguel, pupil Luis Gabriel Miguel of Grade 2 Special Science Class. Advisor, Mrs. Merly P. Himan. Second place goes to Mr. and Mrs. Elmer Tugoto Sr., pupil Sernan Lebron Tugoto of Grade 3 Special Science Class. Advisor, Mrs. Lonnie Grace F. Balasa. And the first place goes to Mr. and Mrs. Jennifer Javier, pupil Laika J. Javier of Grade 3 Special Science Class. Advisor, Mrs. Lonnie Grace F. Balasa. Congratulations!
To conclude the program, let us hear a message from Sir Josie Brillantes, Coordinator of At-Home Learning Spaces.
Not enough to express my heartfelt gratitude to all of you, dear parents, fellow teachers, stakeholders, for doing a great part to make this At-Home Learning Spaces program on distance learning modalities under the new education landscape a success. You have proven, dear parents, that learning takes place even in the absence of face-to-face classes through your cooperation and support to your children. Learning happens not just in school, but more so at home with your help, guidance, encouragement, and motivation. You, parents, are the first teachers of your kids at home. The values and the teachings they learn from you really matters. To everyone who had been a part of this great endeavor, Thank you so much for your unselfish support, especially to all the parents and guardians who participated. To our winners, congratulations! You did a great job. Keep it up. And to the non-winners, you still have room for improvement.
This program has been a wonderful showcase of creativity and resourcefulness of Cuartero Central School's learners, parents, and stakeholders. May we continue to support and uphold the different programs of the Department of Education. Once again, this has been your host, Sir Mark, wishing everyone good health. Keep safe, everyone.